So welcome to Held Hostage. This is a ransomware primer. We're going to talk about a couple of things today. We're going to do an overview of what ransomware is, a background on ransomware, and then where we're seeing ransomware. And then we're going to do some case studies. These are real-world engagements that I've worked. And we're going to talk about some common threads within those and some not so common threads. I am going to attempt to do a live demo of a BitPaymer infection. So we're going to play with some live malware. And then I'm going to give you guys some tips for protecting your environment that you can take away and help secure both your families and your company's networks. So let's talk about ransomware. And one of the questions that we often get is, why is ransomware so popular? And the answer to that is that it's a good attack. It's cheap and it's effective. The level of investment required by an attacker to deploy a ransomware attack is very small compared to the return that they get on that. So what is ransomware besides a pain? We define ransomware as malware with encryption. So not all malware is ransomware, but all ransomware is malware. It's mostly non-destructive. It started out non-destructive. We've seen it take some destructive trends in the past, but primarily it's non-destructive. It's virtually impossible to crack. Using RSA 2048 encryption, it would essentially take you until the heat death of the universe using the harness power of every computer on the face of the planet to crack one hash. So you're probably not going to get your data back. And then your ransom is paid in cryptocurrencies. So primarily we see that in Bitcoin. We haven't really seen step out into Ethereum or Litecoin or anything like that, but the ransom is primarily paid in cryptocurrencies. And so how did we get here? So way back in the dark ages, before most of us even used computers, 1989, we had a little piece of malware called Cyborg. And that was the very first piece of ransomware. And we'll talk about these more in depth here in a minute. But if you fast forward from 89 to 2005, you get to your first modern ransomware, which we know as GPCoder. And then in 2008, we had the scourge of fake AV, which 10 years later really has not gone away. You have your Locker variants in 2011, so Locker, WinLock, Reveton. In 2013, you get into your modern crypto ransomware. So that's CryptoLocker, Cryptowall, TeslaCrypt, Locky, all of these things. And then in 2017, we have everybody's favorite marketing headline in WannaCry, and then the not Petya or Petya attack, however you want to talk about that. But let's take a step back to the Jurassic Age of ransomware, and let's talk about Cyborg. And just as a note, I want to say this is literally the only image of Cyborg I could find on the internet. So it's fairly rare, and I couldn't find an installer for it anywhere. But it first appeared in 1989. And it was distributed on 5.25-inch floppy disks, if anybody in this room knows what those are. So we have one hand. But it replaced autoexec.bat on a system, and it was used to count the number of system boots. And so once we get to 90 boots, it encrypts the system and demands $189 in ransom. For 1989, that's a fairly steep figure. I haven't done the conversion to modern money for inflation, but it's fairly steep. And it relied on symmetric cryptography. So this is not something that had a call home feature or anything like that. It's literally very simplistic in that it counted the number of boots, and then once it's up to 90, it locks down the system. And then we start to see a change in this once we get into the future. Once we go to 2005, we start to see your first modern ransomware. So your things that have the help how to decrypt your files. And these maintain persistence via a run key, and then it deletes itself upon successful encryption. So after it encrypts the system, it then deletes itself, and you wouldn't be able to detect the installer. And again, we're seeing early variants here using symmetric key encryption. So if you had the wherewithal, you could have actually decrypted these on the local machine. We didn't get into asymmetric encryption yet. And we get into around 2008 what we call fake AV, which is not quite ransomware. It uses the same distribution methods in terms of social engineering, pandering to people's fear that they have something on their systems. Did not encrypt data, but what it did was really scare people into paying for it. So you would see one of these where it would find that you had 30,000 infected files on your system, and then it would ask you for just a measly $29.95, and we'll take care of all of that. When actually what it did would detect stuff like text files and call those infections. So it's really working off of fear, uncertainty, and doubt, or FUD, as we like to call it. In late 2012, early 2013, we start seeing the locker variants. These are WinLock, Reveton. Don't know if anybody here reads Russian, but primarily they come out of Russia. And as we can see here, we do have a lock screen. And what these were distributed via exploit kits. So they would lock the desktop, making the system inaccessible. And they were known to impersonate law enforcement. So if you ever had an instance where you had a customer or an employee that said, oh, I've got a pop-up screen that says I have child pornography on my system. And very obviously, you would hope that they're not pornographers, but we'll see. Things like Reveton would impersonate those and use that fear to get them to pay, the fear of having people know that you may or may not have done these things. And then what we get into in the modern days are modern ransomwares. So Locky, Cryptowall, things like that. Modern ransomware uses RSA 2048 encryption and AES 256. That encryption is performed server-side. So that prevents local decryption, so it's asymmetric encryption. Those lock screens are written in every directory where encrypted files are present. And then the time of encryption can be determined from the write times on those help files. What we often find now is that the ransomware will actually replace or will not replace the write times on the files it encrypts. So it's better to use the write times of the files that it drops to determine a time of infection. And then last year, actually right around this time, we have everybody's favorite marketing headline, WannaCry. This is a worming ransomware. It spreads via unpatched Windows installations. It uses Eternal Blue and to take advantage of the MS17010 exploit. The ransomware aspect is really poorly designed and is really not the newsworthy part of it. The newsworthy aspect was the worming capability. Because what was the last real worm that we dealt with was probably Config around 2009. So you had essentially an 8-9 year period where nobody had seen a worm in the wild, and a lot of people got caught unprepared. And one of the other things we've noticed is ransomware as a service. And what we have here is a screenshot of the GitHub page for Hidden Tier. And you can actually go out to this GitHub page and download proof of concept ransomware. And essentially what this means is that a large number of cyber criminals really don't have to develop their own ransomware. They can go grab an installer off of GitHub, distribute it, and then make some money that way. It developed even further with the Satan ransomware, where the developers became shareholders. They said, we will help you develop this and distribute it. You give us a 30% cut. So it really reinforces that malware and adversarial attackers, while they can be political, they are also business oriented. So malware is a big business. If you have gray morals, you know, maybe you want to drive a Mercedes building ransomware. I don't recommend that, but. So how do these infections occur? We have primary methods of infection, and there are 3 of those. We have vulnerabilities, email, and unpatched software. With your vulnerabilities, your families of Cryptowall and TeslaCrypt really tended to use those. They would exploit the Angler exploit kit and the Nuclear exploit kit, which took advantage of Flash and Java. And then we also had WannaCry, obviously, that took advantage of Windows vulnerabilities. One of the things that we often try to do in our recommendations is say, you know, try to get Flash and Java out of your environment. We really stopped doing that after we started getting laughed at on wrap-up calls when people in the banking industry that have, you know, long-term applications that run on a version of Java that's at this point probably 15 years old can't really get rid of it. So we had to come at that from another point. Locky is a campaign that really loves to push email. And we've seen this really in a resurgence around Christmas time. We actually had one in December of 2017. They love to use fake invoice attachments. So your fake FedEx, UPS notices, people still haven't caught on that FedEx and UPS don't send you PDF files that are actually executables. And then Word docs that have macros in them. And those Word docs will reach out, grab the malicious executable, download it, and install it. And then we have your unpatched software. So things like SAMAS used the unpatched JBoss instances. That happened really about 2 years ago, but we still see those once in a while. And then remote desktop is another one. If you've got 3389 exposed to the internet, you are probably going to get hit at some point with a brute force attack, if not with ransomware. So where are we seeing these? There are actually two answers to this question. The short answer is everywhere, and the long answer is no, really, everywhere. But we have three primary verticals where we see a lot of ransomware attacks. That's going to be in healthcare, because you have your hospitals, imaging centers, clinical offices, these places that really may not have visibility into what's running. You have your financial services institutions, which are especially vulnerable during tax season. And then oil and natural gas, because you have a lot of remote workers that are often maybe not on managed systems, but have access to file shares and things like that. So you could get an infection out in the field, and that can jump back into your environment. Let's talk about a little bit in the trenches. And the tagline here is how much data got encrypted, because that's a question that we asked on the phone with one of these. And so before I get into the case studies, I'm going to talk a little bit about the analysis tools that I use. So this is not an endorsement of these tools. This is simply what I use. I am ENCE certified, so I primarily do a lot of my forensic work within Encase. We were using IEF. We've moved to Axiom from Magnet Forensics. Your standard Shellbags Explorer, Jump List Explorer, all the places where you would look for file traces. For memory analysis, we use Volatility and Redline. Depends on if you like command line interfaces or graphical interfaces. Cuckoo Sandbox is great for detonating samples in a safe environment. This is a GitHub link to the Cuckoo that Optiv uses internally. It is a break-off of the actual main Cuckoo Sandbox, but it works pretty well. And then we have a list of just other tools. ANJP Triforce is fantastic for MFT analysis, so master file table. If you want to find out when something was written, the MFT doesn't lie. Event Log Explorer is great for looking at remote desktop connections. Just metadata is fantastic because you can throw all kinds of IPs at it. If you take a list of IPs, feed it to just metadata, it'll feed you back all the who is, the geolocation data, all that stuff. So it's great for building heat maps of where your attacks are coming from. ThreatCrowd is great for making pretty graphs for executives for reports. You can look at associations from MD5s as well as URLs, domains. And then all of the Nearsoft tools, browsing history view, and when we get into network analysis, we like to look at Wireshark and things like that. So again, not an endorsement, these are just what I use. Maybe give you some ideas when you do your own investigations. Let's take a look at our first real-world example. This is going to be a healthcare environment. And while we're looking at these, I want you guys to kind of get an idea of these environments and look for some commonalities and maybe some things that aren't so common in these. We have a surgical provider here with multiple remote care centers. So there's no dedicated on-site IT staff. All of that IT work is done remotely or with temporary on-site visits. So essentially what happens is that when these sites don't have IT on staff, what they're looking for is when they get these infections, they have to report that. And then you have a delay time between the time the ticket goes in and the time that a tech is dispatched. But what we had here was a workstation infected with Cryptowall. And that infection occurred via an exploit kit delivered through a malicious ad on a gaming website. So somebody wasn't adhering to the acceptable use policy, decided to go play a couple of flash games. Unfortunately, they weren't using AppLocker internally, so any ad on that site could have been compromised. They came across a compromised one. And that ended up with the local workstations and the shared folders on the server getting encrypted. So let's talk a little bit about Cryptowall. This first appeared in early to mid 2014 as version 1, still present today as version 4. When CryptoLocker was taken down in 2013 as part of Operation Tovar, which was a multinational effort to take down the botnet behind CryptoLocker, Crypto Defense arose from the ashes of that environment. And then Cryptowall is an evolution of Crypto Defense. The current versions use RSA 2048 and AES 128 CBC to encrypt that data. Communications are routed via I2P and the Tor protocols. So if you're not sniffing secure traffic on your environment, you're probably not seeing C2 traffic from ransomware. So you probably want to take a look at 443 if you have the capability. So we have another healthcare example. And again, we have another imaging provider with multiple remote imaging centers. These guys have no dedicated on-site IT staff. All IT work was done remotely or with temporary on-site visits. We're starting to see a pattern here. The workstation was infected with the Locky ransomware, and this came in through email. So we had a Word document on a fake invoice. When the user opened that doc, it asked to enable macros. They enabled it. The macros connected out, downloaded the ransomware binary. Game over. You had a locked workstation, and shared folders on the server got encrypted. So talking about Locky, this first appeared in early to mid 2016 as version 1 and is still present today as version 2 and version 3. There are multiple variants, including Thor and Osiris, so we have developers that are fans of mythology. And then the current versions use RSA 2048 and AES 128 ECB to encrypt that data. Again, all of that key generation is done server-side. And then C2 communications use a hard-coded IP address. And then if that gets blocked, it uses domain generation algorithms to build out domains that it can contact. So if you're hard blocking its IP addresses, it can detect that and then build domains that it'll talk to outside of that. So our third example here is a petroleum and natural gas industry. It's a multinational, and they have a combination of on-site and remote IT workers. They have a high visibility and many tools in place to monitor that stuff. So essentially, we're seeing a change here. Instead of there being remote IT staff, it's a combination of on-site and IT staff and a bunch of tools. This user system was infected with TeslaCrypt. The infection occurred via the Angler exploit kit during a browsing session. And that workstation was infected along with an 80 terabyte SAN, and the entire thing was encrypted. So when they got on the phone with us, they had us in one ear and EMC in the other ear, and they were screaming into both phones. So that infection occurred on a Friday leading into the weekend, and the tools that they had in place did not alert on that infection, and as they were not tailored for ransomware. And so what we had happen was that infection was not identified until a day and a half after the infection and encryption. So that ransomware essentially had a day and a half to run rampant in the SAN. There is a happy ending to that story. They actually had hourly incremental backups on that SAN, so they only ended up losing a day and a half of work, but if that had happened on a Monday and not a Friday, it could have been a lot worse. So test your backups. But talking about TeslaCrypt, this first appeared in early 2015 as version 1 and remained live through 2016 as version 3. It was delivered via the Angler exploit kit, and it uses RSA 4096 to encrypt data because twice as good is twice as better, and then Tor for C2 communications. So again, we're seeing the use of asymmetric encryption and secure traffic for C2 communications. The developers actually shut down the TeslaCrypt project and issued an apology around December of 2016. It was very kind of them. ESET thereafter released a decryption tool, so if you actually do have a system that was encrypted with TeslaCrypt and you want to get it decrypted, those keys are in the wild now, so you should be able to decrypt that. So let's take a look at some common threads. All of the tools that we had in place in these environments were reactive. IT personnel really had no clue something was wrong until it was too late. And by that, the encryptions weren't identified until users couldn't access their data. So essentially, somebody tried to access a shared CSV and they couldn't get to it. That encryption began at the perimeter, the workstation, and worked inwards towards the shares. So we're going to do a little test here, a little live demo of some ransomware, and hopefully this works. You always know how live demos go in conferences. But we're going to talk a little bit about BitPaymer. This is distributed via remote desktop, and this is a sample that I recovered from an engagement that I worked. So this is a live sample. It uses ADS to mask its running process. So when you actually run the malware, essentially what it does is it spawns an alternate data stream that doesn't share the process's name. So it's really hard to detect in memory if you're looking for specific process names. It hides in app data, and it uses an auto run key for persistence. So it is fairly straightforward, fairly simple. But let's make sure this works. So we'll come over to our VM here. All right, so I have Process Explorer running here, and we'll just move that over to the side. Just to give you an idea of what's running on here, We have a couple of files here. We have our standard end user license agreement for Process Explorer. Just have it here as an example. We have our friendly neighborhood Slowpoke and our friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. And I have these in here just as an example of files that, you know, maybe would be in a user's directory or something like that. And what I want to show with this is not specifically how to do an analysis or anything like that, but just how fast a system will get encrypted once ransomware is in an environment. So we're just going to take this binary and we're going to run it. We have the ADS stream pop up, and there you go. You now have an encrypted system. And so what we have here is this is our original JPEG for Slowpoke. And this is our README file. And so let's just pop this open in Notepad. Oh, our network's been penetrated. So everything within the host environment has been encrypted with a strong algorithm. And then here's your onion address and a nice Proton mail account for decrypting that. So essentially what happened in this environment was somebody penetrated the network via remote desktop. They gained access to domain administrator keys and then ran rampant. So they had domain administrator access, disabled the environment's antivirus protection, and then deployed this. Unfortunately, the end game for this was the customer had to entirely rebuild their environment because it was compromised from the top down. So that's just a simple example of how quickly ransomware can encrypt a system. And then, as we see, it's no longer sitting in memory. So if you're not monitoring memory, if you're not doing process detection on endpoints, you're probably going to miss that spawn. So how do we protect against things like that? And what we've come up with is kind of a conglomeration of items to help protect your environment. We're talking about patches, backups, file integrity monitoring, endpoint process visibility, security awareness training, email extension filters, and then AppLocker, software restriction GPOs, and network segmentation. And these are not in any specific order. These are all of equal importance. So let's start by talking about patches, backups, and file integrity monitoring. So patching systems is imperative. We saw this about this time last year with WannaCry. If you can't get rid of Java and Flash, or if you laugh at consultants that tell you to get rid of them, please make sure they're updated as well as you can. Tested backups are the cheapest and easiest mitigation against ransomware. And a backup is really just data unless it's tested. So if you have a disaster recovery plan, if you have a business continuity plan and you don't test it, it's worth about as much as the paper it's written on. And then file integrity monitoring helps identify and revert changes ransomware makes. So what we call these are the canary in the coal mine. So if you have a piece of data that you're using to test within the environment and it triggers and you notice it, you can actually help to stop that infection before it occurs. Endpoint process visibility is great. It's critically important that you know what's running on your systems. Endpoint monitoring software can alert on those process spawns, like we saw with BitPaymer here. Those solutions can provide one-click hash banning. So one of the things that we've noticed about ransomware developers is that they're not very creative. They will send out a bunch of installers that all have the same MD5 hash, which is why traditional AV works so well against ransomware. But then again, we've also seen that they actively develop these things. So they may flip a bit and change that MD5 as soon as a detection comes out. We like to use VirusTotal to monitor binaries, so do the bad guys. So understanding what is running on a system is key. And we'll talk a little bit about AppLocker, SRPs, network segmentation. There was a question earlier in one of the presentations about how effective is whitelisting. One of the things that we notice is that whitelisting is super effective, but you're going to need one dude working 40 hours a week to keep everything appropriately whitelisted. It is free with full documentation from Microsoft, and that's AppLocker and software restriction policies. AppLocker works the same as software restriction policies, But AppLocker is for Win7 and 2K8 R2 and higher, and SRPs are for lower systems. It will stop most ransomware and malware in its tracks, but it's super intensive to maintain. So there's a trade-off for it. Network segmentation is beyond the scope of this talk, really, but you want to use a network architect and build out your Fort Knox. So all of your critical systems need to be protected. And really at this point, if you're worried about endpoints and protecting them, it's probably more effective to just wipe and rebuild a system if it gets infected, and focus that security on your gold mine. Email extension filters, we see a lot of ransomware come in via email. So what we recommend is to block attachments with both common and uncommon extensions. Your basic list is zip, JS, exe, because nobody should be getting those through email. If you're feeling saucy, you can block all the Office stuff, but that's probably not going to go over real well. In a perfect world, you would use a secure transfer solution. So where nobody gets attachments, you just go to a portal and download them. And your ransomware and malware campaigns use email attachments because it works. So they wouldn't use it if people didn't click on it. We'll talk a little bit about security awareness training. You want to train people to know if something looks suspicious. It's a learning experience, not a shaming experience. Please don't have the wall of sheep for people that have clicked on the phishing email. And even security folks get compromised, and we usually know what we're doing. But I can count on more than one hand the number of people on my team that have been caught up in phishing awareness exercises. So just remember, at the end of the day, good security hygiene starts with the basics. So what you really want to do is cover as much as you can with what you have. And if you want to reach out to me, my email is up there and my Twitter is up there. I'm not very funny, so if you follow people on Twitter for them to be funny, it's not me. I am a managing consultant with Optiv's Enterprise Incident Management stuff, and I appreciate your time today. Does anybody have any questions? Yes, sir.
Maybe like a few slides back, you mentioned about how to prevent against so you see, I guess, how attachments go to a secure server.
Yeah. So that was back on the email extension filters. Yeah. So the question, do you have a specific question, or do you just want to talk about that a little bit?
Like how why is that better than what makes that a good solution? I'm not sure.
Okay, so just as an example, at Optiv, we use Proofpoint. And again, not endorsing this. This is simply what we use internally. When we get attachments that can come in through Proofpoint, it's automatically virus scanned. It's automatically scanned for exploits, things like that. Then we have to physically go and download that and then run it, rather than it just being something where it comes in on an email and you can just click on it. Because as we saw earlier, I believe last year, there were exploits in the wild where you didn't even have to click on something in a document. You literally just moused over it. And that can go out and trigger a malware download. So having it come in through a portal gives you that extra layer of defense, so things are scanned prior to them ever seeing the end user. Mobile ransomware, that's a fun one. I was waiting for that question. I was waiting for the question of, have you guys seen ransomware that likes to sleep before it encrypts? So mobile ransomware is interesting. We tend to see it not as much as your standard Windows ransomware, because when you're dealing with mobile devices, they're less pervasive than Windows in an office environment. There is some mobile ransomware out there. We don't often do much with it, so I couldn't really speak to that. But it's not as predominant as some of the other ransomware strains. So sorry, it's probably not the answer you were looking for, but yeah. It's not as predominant, and to speak to the ransomware that sleeps before it infects systems, it's out there, but we don't see it as much. Again, that gives the bad guys more time to get caught when you do something like that, because as soon as some of that stuff hits the web, it's already being uploaded by researchers, being torn apart, things like that. So yeah, it's not as predominant as some of the strains that I talked about here, but it is out there. Yeah. Yep. Any other questions? Thank you very much.